Hey folks, Mark Locklear here with a screencast and lecture on Chapter 4. Hopefully we've digested Chapters 1, 2, and 3, and you're okay with all of that. Now in Chapter 4, we're going to we're going to look a little more at controllers, and we're going to also introduce models here. So let's go down and let's create a new Rails app. We're going to be working for the next couple of chapters, at least. We'll be working with this guest book, what we call a guest book app. So I'm going to back out here, and again, just to sort of sanity check my environment, I'm going to do Ruby-V. Again, I'm using Ruby 223, and then of course I can do Rails-V, and that's going to show me right now I'm using beta 2. Hopefully by the time you're watching this, we'll be on the release version of Rails 5.0 or .x. So we're going to create a new guestbook app here. So we're just going to do Rails new guestbook. This is going to run. While Bundle's running there, I'll talk about controllers a little bit. So we're creating a new Rails app now. Next thing we're going to do is generate a controller. We're going to call that controller entries in this case. And what this entries controller is going to allow us to do is allow us to control entries that the user does. We're going to create a text box and allow the user to enter their name and submit that to our controller. Okay, our Rails app is done creating, so we'll change directory in guestbook, and now we'll create our controller called entries. So we'll do Rails. I'm going to do G for short instead of typing out generator, and we'll do controller and entries. Just as a side note, generally our controllers are going to be plural, so you notice that instead of entry, E-N-T-R-Y, I'm doing entries. Generally our controllers are plural and our models are going to be singular, and we'll see that later. It sort of takes some getting used to in Rails. I think the first year or so I was doing Rails, or maybe the first couple of years, that was always sort of a hang up for me, is trying to figure out whether when you're creating specific controllers or models, whether they should be plural or singular. So Rails G controller entries, and this is going to create. Of course, we said when we generate a controller, we get a controller, and in this case, we got a folder in views. Notice here, but notice we did not sort of different from when we created the hello controller previously, since we did not pass in an action here. Remember that our controller takes it can take two arguments, a controller name and then also any actions we want to create. Notice since we did not pass in or add an action to the Rails generator, then there's not a view created. So for instance, if we would have went Rails G controller entries and then index, that would have created an index view for us. So if we so now what we'll do is open this up in Sublime just so we can take a look at it. So now we'll look at our entries controller. So of course we don't have much here. Again, we didn't create an action associated with it, and of course we didn't create a view either. So let's go back here, and so now we're going to sort of manually create. Now notice I've got some bold stuff here. We're still working on some syntax for the book, so you can just ignore that for the time being. But notice we're going to create this sign in action in our entries controller. Now again, we could have done this if we would have passed this sign in as an argument when we created our controller, it would have Rails would have created it for us. So just so we're clear, I could have came back here and I could have said sign on underscore in. If I would have passed that in as an action, it would have created that for us. So we're just creating it manually. That's all we're doing here. And as you sort of get to know, as you learn Rails more, you'll probably tend to manually create your own actions and things like that rather than doing it from the command line or from doing it inside generators, just because it sort of gives you more control over the code that you're writing. And in fact, yeah, we make a note about that here. Okay, and so now we're going to manually create our view since we, again, didn't create that since we didn't generate that sign in action. There wasn't a view created for us, so we're going to do that. We're going to do that inside of Sublime here. So I'm just going to save this, and we'll go inside App Views. Now again, the entries folder is there for us because we created a controller with that same name, but the file is not there. So let's go back here and let's grab this code, and I'm going to paste that in here and go ahead and get rid of some of these comments. Save that. Now again, the name, I'll give you a second to you tell me what you think the name should be here. I'll give you a second to think about that. Okay, so because this is the sign in action, it's going to be signin.html.erb. So that's what links this view, that actual name there, because it's called sign underscore in. That's going to link it to this action here. If we would have named it, blah, if we'd have named it sign out, then this would not be in a sort of an active view. Okay. Now the last thing we need to do to sort of tie all this in together, if we try to load our Rails app and visit this route, if we try to go to entries/sign in like you see here in our web browser, that's not going to work. The Rails is going to tell us that there's no route. If you remember in some of the diagrams we looked at earlier, the first thing Rails does when you type in a URL, the first thing it does is go to that routes.rb file. So now we need to add that to our routes file. So I'm going to go here, go to routes.rb, and in fact I'll just paste this code in. So we'll talk about get and post in a second here. But for now, let's put that in like this, and let's go ahead and clean up some formatting here. Okay, so what this says is we'll talk about our HTTP verbs later in the book, but this get says that the user can go to entries/sign in, and then what that says is, hey, send this request to the entries controller and then the sign in action. And get is an HTTP verb, and basically what that's saying is, hey, we're making a request here. We're requesting data from this controller and action. And then post does just the opposite of that. We'll look at post says, hey, I want to send some data to this controller and action. So with that in place, let's go back to our Rails app, and we should be able to run this and see it work. So let's sort of see what we see here. So again, we can see that our Rails app looks like it's running okay. So now if we go just to the root of the Rails app, we should see our welcome to Rails page there. And now if we go to entries sign in, okay, I'm getting an error there. So let's see if I can figure out what the issue is. So yeah, I don't quite have that right. Let's go to entries sign in. Okay. So if I go there, boom, we've got a page. So let's look at our HTML just so we sort of know what's going on here. So we're doing this form 4 tag. So notice we've got a Notice we've got a block here. The reason we know this is a block is we sort of see this do up top, and we see this end here. So we've got a block, and the form tag, basically what that allows us to do is create an HTML type form tag. And then of course we've just got this p tag, which is just regular text. We've got a text field tag. So you'll notice we're using this, Rails uses this convention of this underscore tag for these various HTML items. You can use your developer tools in your web browser to go in and sort of look at some of the HTML that is being created from these tags. But essentially, text field tag is going to create a text field inside your web browser. Now, in this case, we're going to be able to apply this visitor name symbol to the tag, and then we're also sort of preloading this at name variable. We'll talk more about that later. And then you've got a submit tag there. That's basically just a submit button is what it creates, and then we're adding the text sign in to it. Or we're not adding the text. Yeah, right. We're adding this text sign into it. Okay, so if we put some information in here, let's just see what it does. Well, that didn't seem to do anything, right? At least it didn't give us any feedback on what it was doing. Let's go back to our web browser. So now's a good time. I don't think we've done this yet. Now's a good time to talk about your web server console and sort of some of the feedback you get there. So if we look at what I'm looking for is, so first off, here's this get, and you remember we added a route in our routes.rb file that was that started with get. So when you load the page, this is this get sign in right here. Let's come down a bit. Now this was actually the original error when we went there. When we went to that, if you remember, I put in entry instead of entry, so that was the error there. So let's come down here. So here's the actual get for entry sign in, and notice we just get a sort of a processing message that says, okay, I've processed this HTML.erb file, and then also get a 200 response back. And then notice here's our submit. Notice I typed in the name Mark, and notice we set our visitor name. That's sort of the symbol that's associated with that is Mark. So hopefully you can see this process of view, and we are sending data from that view, sending it to the sign-in controller, and then of course you sort of get a response back. So let's look at our HTML again and see if we see, or let's look at our controller. Yeah, so in this case it's saying, hey, we're finding the sign-in controller. Now in this case we're not doing anything in the controller, so let's make our sign-in controller actually do something. So we're going to come here and we're going to grab this bit of code, and we'll go back to our sign-in controller, and we'll paste that in. So what is this doing here? So this is taking we're creating a variable called name. Remember the @ symbol's in front, so that makes it an instance variable. And then we're getting our params visitor name and assigning that to our name variable. Let's go to our console again and see if we can see where that's coming through. I'm going to scroll back through and look for the last submission that we did. So remember when we were submitting, these were all blank, but earlier I submitted one called Mark. Notice it's assigning this parameter called visitor underscore name, and again that's going to be the same parameter that we're sending from our view. That's that visitor underscore name that we see here. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this, and then we'll do a submission. We'll reload our page, and then we'll add Barnabas here. All right. Now notice what we're doing here. Notice that we got this response. Notice the hello. We appended that variable name to this h1 tag up top here. So let's see how or why we're doing that. So a couple things happen here. So now we can sort of see this link between our view, this sign in .html.erb. So let's just sort of walk through this form tag. This form tag here, we're associating the action to this sign in action in our controller here. Now, this view is already linked to our entries controller. Now, why is that? That's because it's in this entries folder here inside view. So that's sort of that links it to that sign in, or that links it to that entries controller. That's some of that wiring that's sort of under the covers in Rails. And then notice we've got this text field tag, and what we're saying is, hey, anything that's submitted inside this text field tag, we're going to the parameter name is going to be visitor underscore name. And so that's why when we submit anything from this text box, regardless of what it is, it's going to have the parameter visitor underscore name. So from this view, once we hit the submit button, we move back over to the controller, the sign-in controller, and what we say here is, hey, anything that has this visitor name parameter, assign it to this name variable, right? And so now the response part of this is that sign in is then sent back, and the view is reloaded, and that's where this at name is here. Now what we say is that, if assuming this variable at name is not blank, we're gonna display it next to this, up top in this h1 tag, assuming this at name variable is not blank. We're going to display it here. Okay, so that's why we see. Let's look at the functionality a little more. If we put Mark in here, so it updates there. We put Calvin in here, updates here. So if we look in our book, we've got a nice explanation sort of our routes. And again, we'll sort of see this later when we create some models and do other things. But in this case, we've talked about this before, that based on our URL, this first name in between these forward slashes is going to be the controller name, and then that second one is the action name. So you can sort of see that here. If we look at something like this, that's going to be an invalid route, because again, in our routes.rb file, we don't have anything that matches that. Now later on, we'll look at these. We'll look at when we use scaffolding and other things. There's some default actions inside Rails. In this case, it's the example it uses is show, but we'll talk about that a little more. So I think we discussed this in earlier chapters, but again, so think about this in terms, we've sort of we haven't added the model to this yet, but we've certainly got the controller and view piece here. That again, we said that we would think about, we can sort of take the internet out of this equation. We're just using our Puma web server in this case, but again, when the visitor visits this entries /sign in route, first thing we're part of Rails we're looking at is that routes.rb file. Then we're going through the controller, so that's being set to that entries sign in controller and action. We're not using a model in this case, so now the controller responds back, and our view is being loaded. So that's sort of that response request cycle. So now let's create a model. So again, when we said when we think about models in Rails, we're basically talking about a database. So the idea is we're think about database tables and then fields inside that table. So in this case, we're going to create a model called entry. And so let's just go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to do Control C to stop my server, and I'm going to do Rails G model entry. Remember I mentioned earlier that we said generally our controllers are going to be plural and our models are going to be singular. So you can see in this case I'm using entry, the singular of entry instead of entries. So a couple things happen here. Number one, the two files that we really want to focus on, we won't worry about the test related files for now, are the entry.rb in the app models folder, and then we got this migration file. So what is this migration file all about? Well, the best way to talk about it is to look at it. So let's just go there. Let's go ahead and close these so we don't have too many tabs open. So let's look at our migration file first. So notice the file name first off. Notice that the file name is called create entries.rb, and then notice there's a timestamp in front of that. So any migration files, anytime you create any database related items in Rails, it's going to create this migration file. A timestamp, a time and date stamp is going to be is going to be associated with that migration file, and in fact it's going to be in the file name. And then normally you get this convention of create, and since we called it since we called the model entry, it used this convention of create underscore entries, and that'll be true for most models that you create. Now the model is going to be empty in this case. I say it's empty. There's not any fields that are being created in this case other than the timestamps, although we're going to go in and add some in. I won't go into migrations in depth right now. We'll cover that in a later chapter. So now we'll go in and add a field to our table. So again, we said entry was our model name, so that's going to create a table called entries, and you can see here that's what this create table method does. And now we're going to create a field called name that's going to be of type string. So we'll talk more about the different data types in Rails later, but just know for right now, let's put this in and then let's get a little formatting going. Right now this is going to be a table called entries, and it's going to have other fields in it, such as timestamps, but the one we're going to be most concerned about is name. And you probably see where we're going with this. Our name that we are submitting inside of our inside of our form, inside our view, we're going to be not only dealing with that in the controller, but we're going to also squirrel that away in our database. So we've got some kind of dynamic ability to save data. Let's talk about migration. So we said these files are called migration files. So now that we've created this file, we actually need to create that table and the associated field in our database. Now in this case we're going to be using SQLite. So I'm just going to do rake. In fact, we'll do I may slip up and use rake here. Rails 5 introduced the ability, rather than to use rake, we can actually use Rails. So let's use Rails db:/migrate, and that's sort of a holdover from earlier versions of Rails, and we'll probably talk more about rake task later, but just for right now you can use the Rails command to migrate your database. So what we're saying in here, notice something too. I'm going to run this same command again, and notice nothing's going to happen here. So why is that? So remember I talked about a time and date stamp associated with a migration file. So this whole concept of migration files and migrations in general is one that Rails sort of introduced to the web development community and framework, and now for the most part other frameworks have implemented this too. I know that Django has for sure, and then I also think there's some PHP for frameworks that have this concept of migrations. You know, the challenge is just to sort of take a step back and look at it from a bigger picture perspective. The challenge that web development in the past has had is the database was sort of separate from the database and the schema and the management of the database was sort of separate from the other things that were happening in the application. So the code that would handle, the views, and then this business logic and these things were sort of separate from your database code and what those things did. So migrations, what migrations did for us is sort of brought all these things together so they live in a single code base, and we can also manage those things from our code base too. So that's the advantage you've got there. In addition to that, when we look at migration files and this idea of a time and date stamp, what that allows us to do is at any point in our development cycle, we sort of know where the database is and was at, right? So we saw that here. When I ran db:/migrate this first time, notice this migration ran. Now I ran db:/migrate again, and nothing happened because the application sort of knows, based on this time and date stamp, that migration has already been run. If you've got some history doing web development, that will probably make some sense to you, and you can see the advantage to it. If you're new to web development, that may not all make sense, or you may not see why that's an advantage. But you just know that's a big deal, and that it's a good thing from a web development perspective. Okay. So now let's look at our entry.rb file, and let's talk about that. So we talked about migration. We looked at our migration file here. Let's look at our entry.rb file. So this is pretty barren, right? By default, it doesn't give us much, and essentially all this is an entry class. That's the name of the model is created, and it's inheriting from application record, which is Rails sort of base database class that handles a lot of database related items inside Rails. So we're not going to do anything there for now. Let's just go into our entries controller, and we're going to add a line here to create an entry in our database. So let's go back to our controller. And we'll add this line here, and let's save that. Okay, so what are we doing here? So essentially all we're doing here is, so we already had our name variable that we were assigning our visitor name parameter to. So now we're going to take that name variable and pass that along to our model, and then that's going to create an entry in our database. So we're creating this entry variable here, and then notice we're doing this entry dot create, and then we're passing along this this name symbol, and we're assigning the name variable to it. So all that may be somewhat confusing, but it'll sort of make sense as we do it and we continue to work with it. Let me make a note about this in the book too. Notice too that I have had students that sort of had problems with this in the past. That this entry dot create and then passing this hash into this create method was a little confusing for some students. But essentially, it's a combination of these commands here. That rather than doing entry dot new and then because we created a name, because we know there's a name field inside the entry table, and then assigning this @name to it, and then doing a save. This single command, this sort of one-line command, wraps these three commands up in that single command. Okay. So let's load the app now and see if this all works for us. So I'm going to sort of reload here. Let's make sure we've saved this, and then I need to go back and start the server back up. So now I'm going to come back here and make sure this is loaded, and then I'm going to say maybe Henry, and of course we see hello Henry up here. We had that functionality before, so we don't have any real indication inside the web page that anything is happening, but let's go to our server console and see what we get. So we can see a few different things here that's maybe somewhat different than what we've seen in the past. So notice here we've got this insert we've got this insert statement, and notice it's also it says SQL here. So what's happening here is this is our insert statement that we added inside of our controller. Let's go look at that again. Remember, we had this entry dot create here, and so that's essentially what we're seeing here. That it's and this sort of reads like SQL, right? It's sort of a verbose, I guess, form of SQL because we're getting a lot thrown at us. But essentially this is saying, hey, insert into the entries table, we're going to create a name, which if you remember we created a name field, and then notice we've also Rails sort of for free gives us this created at and updated at fields inside of our database. And then now we have each of those individual individual attributes for each one of those fields. In this case it was Henry, and then we've also got a timestamp for the created at and the updated at. Then we've also got this commit transaction that lets us know it was saved. Let me show you some console stuff. We'll be probably doing this a lot throughout. This is a good way. You should really warm up to the console in Rails. If you remember earlier, I think we did some things in IRB inside Ruby. So the Rails console is sort of like IRB for Rails. So I can do Rails C here. Now what's happened is I've got a console here that I can interact with the Rails application and the Rails development environment from the console. So for instance, I can do entry.last, and that's going to show me the last entry, which is of course the one we did with Henry. Now notice also I can let's go back to our controller and let's pull this controller code out here. I'm going to copy that and I'm going to put that in here, but I'm going to sort of change some things up here though. So now I can directly do an insert from here, and so I can do Barnabas, and notice what I did here. Now notice this looks very similar to what we saw inside of our web server transaction earlier, but we just did it from the console. And so now we inserted the name Mark inside our database. And in fact, if I do entry.last like I did earlier, notice that it's got I see Mark here. Notice I can also do entry.all, and it's going to show me all of those. And let's see if I can do YAML is sort of convenient. Yeah, I can do this. Notice that if I put a Y in front, this is going to return a YAML, so it's a little more structured. Now you get a whole lot of stuff that you might not want, but notice I get notice like here's the last entry I did Mark, and then I should see Henry all up here also. Yeah, notice here's Henry here. You also get a whole bunch of other stuff in addition to that, but that's just sort of example of using the Rails console to sort of interact with the database. So now we looked at saving some data to the database, and now let's go in and retrieve that data from the database and let's do something with it in our app. As we showed you earlier, we saved when we entered a name and clicked the sign in button, we actually weren't able to we were saving data to the database, but we weren't doing anything with it sort of inside the app. So we're going to go in and add some code to our entries controller. You can see that here, and then we're going to also add some code to our view to actually display that data. So I've already added that to Sublime. So let's just sort of walk through and hit a couple of high points. So a couple things. So again, we're in the sign in action in the controller. Our name variable is still being set the same way, but notice we've got something a little different here. We've got an if then. You don't see the syntax used a whole lot in Rails, but it's it is out there. And in fact, we'll maybe try and remove the then, because I think you can do it either way syntactically. But notice we've got this if name dot blank, then we're going to create a new entry, and we're going to assign the argument we're going to pass to it is our name variable. And then notice also we're setting or creating a new variable down here called entries. So let's look at this if statement and see specifically what's going on here. So the exclamation in Ruby is the not operator. So basically what that says, if if name is not blank, so and then of course the blank method checks to see if it's in an empty string or if it's blank. So basically what this says is if name is not blank, then we want to create an entry in our entry table. And then the final thing we're doing here in the controller is creating this entries variable, and we're assigning entry.all to that. And we'll look at we'll look at that in the console. But essentially, all entry.all does is says, hey, runs a select all query on the entry table if you've got a database background and no SQL well. But essentially, it says, hey, go to the entry table, get me all of the records from there, and assign it to this entries variable here. Okay, that's on the controller side. Now again, if all we do is save this, we're not the view is not going to change any because we haven't updated that yet. So let's see what we do with our view. So in addition, for the most part, everything up front here, this stuff is the same. Notice we've added this previous visitors section. So we've got a simple P tag here, paragraph tag that says previous visitors. And then what we're doing here is this is really common syntax in Ruby. Essentially, it's a block or loop that basically is going to take this entries variable that we created here, and it's just going to loop over each entry and then print out the name for each. Notice while we're doing this, we've got some of this HTML will probably look familiar to you. We're just adding list tags to each entry. So let's just go ahead and run that and see what we get. So back over here in our app, and now notice I've already ran this once, but if I add test in here, of course it's going to add that to the list, adds it to the bottom. Now notice if I don't put anything in here, it shouldn't do anything. Notice it doesn't add any kind of, now there were some previous blank ones that I entered earlier. So let's do some console things while we're here. Let me show you a couple of things there. So again, we drop into the console, we do Rails C. So remember earlier I mentioned that entry.all we were using over here for the entries variable. I can execute this entry.all inside the console, and I think we looked at this earlier. I can do entry.all like that, and again I can also do if you remember, I think I said I shared with you could put a Y in front and sort of get a YAML view of that, so it's a little more structured. Since we've got some old stuff in our database here, again we're just looking at all entries in the database. Let's remove all of these. A quick way to do that is the delete all option in Rails. So I can do entry.delete _ all, and basically that's it. Obviously this is a very destructive obviously that's a very destructive command, so be careful about executing that. So let's go back and start our server back up. Let's go refresh our web page. Okay, so you can see here all the previous visitors are gone. So we can add a couple things in here. Mark, Natasha. And remember too, we're checking that if it's blank, we don't do a submission. So if I do that, notice nothing happens. And in fact, if I go back to my, if we look in the console here, we can see, notice here's the entry for Natasha here. You can see that was inserted correctly. But notice here, we got this visitor name, and it doesn't really give us an indication. It doesn't give us any indication from the controller that it wasn't executed, but if you'll notice here, you don't see this insert statement like you see up top here. Okay, and finally, let's go ahead and wrap the chapter up. There's a few debug things I don't think I'll say anything about. So a lot of these finders are really popular in Rails. They've rewritten a few of these, but essentially these again, these what we call finders are just sort of a way to essentially it's a way to execute SQL inside of Rails, right? Part of the beauty of Rails And you'll see this in other frameworks too, so it's not just a Rails thing. But this idea of active record is what we call an ORM, or an object relational mapper. Essentially what that does is it's an abstracted layer away from the database. So the idea is that as a developer you can just focus on code. You don't have to focus on SQL. You've got the option to use SQL in Rails if you like, but these finders you can really go a long way with using these finders. And many of these finders are optimized in such a way that they're going to execute SQL in the most efficient way. So we've already talked about entry.all. We looked at that earlier, so that's just a way to return all records in a table. We can also do this find, and so you can do find and then pass in an ID. Let's look at that. So I'm going to stop the server here, Control C. I'm going to go, Control C, and I'm going to do Rails C, and I'm inside the console now. So I can do entry.find, and then I can pass in the ID of a record.